I'll give it a couple minutes.
Let people file in.
Yeah, YouTube doesn't exactly like to notify people when we're live right away, if at all. So usually we give it a couple minutes to let people.
I've been trying to direct some of my followers to YouTube, and it's its own community, completely separate platform that people should
What do you?
try to tap
Where's
into.
your followers usually? Like Instagram and.
It's kind of spread across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, but I'm trying to utilize YouTube more often, specifically for that live feature.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of unmatched, and it's the second biggest search engine in the world, so you need to be on YouTube, owned by the first.
Yep.
So gotta be on YouTube.
If only you knew. YouTube is doing independents and progressives, and if you're not corporate, they're doing you dirty. Their algorithm basically like pushes people's feeds with like CNN and these corporate outlets. And if you're an independent outlet, they hide you in a cave. I mean, it's something.
Well, I'm sure, like, following the money, like, probably tied in with one another.
Oh yeah. Google. All right.
You want that stool right there?
Cabinets, yes.
Yeah. Could you? You can adjust it to height-wise if you need to.
I know to knock everything.
Thank you.
Almost hit that.
All right, we can start. Hey there, it's Jordan. I am in Louisville, Kentucky, where, as you can see by the beautiful portrait behind me, has been kind of the center of a lot of this explosion, I guess, across the country in protests, police brutality, empowerment of Black Lives Matter. And Breonna Taylor, actually, a 26-year-old black woman, was killed before George Floyd, but her name I don't think has been mentioned as much as George Floyd. Not that Mr. Floyd shouldn't have had that attention. We saw the video, and obviously the protests have happened after. But Breonna Taylor, months after her murder by Louisville police here, there's still no justice. And beyond Breonna Taylor, what's going on in Louisville right now shows, I mean, just hundreds of years of American segregation, brutality, and white supremacy, all coming out at one time. So I'm happy to start our trip here with Ja'Cory Arthur. You have been a local community organizer and activist here for years, a musician, and you just won a seat on the Louisville City Council. So I want to start with what you told me before, because I guess before this explosion around the country, this movement for Black lives, white people starting to become a little bit more aware of systemic racism, you were talking about those things in your campaign, and I guess people told you, like, maybe not so much talk about the racism. Can you kind of tell me about that?
Absolutely. I announced to run for Metro Council in December of last year, 2019. And when I announced, I talked about having a Metro Black agenda, one where we fixed the wrongs done and the brokenness that exists within the Black community, from jobs to education to healthcare and beyond. And I was told to be careful talking too much about race, because Louisville was not ready to have that conversation. And then you fast forward half a year later, that's the only conversation being had. And I'm so glad that I stayed true to my roots. I truly believe we won because we had nothing to lose. We are already at the very bottom of society, socially, politically, and economically. So what other choice did I have to beat the social justice drum as loud as I possibly could so that we could get justice not only in these streets, but also in political office?
Mm-hmm. And for those, I mean, I'm assuming most of the audience knows the entire situation, but if you don't, in March, Breonna Taylor, she was an EMT worker here in Louisville. She was pretty busy, like a lot of EMT workers, nurses, doctors with coronavirus patients. It started in America in March, the explosion of cases. So about midnight or so, she's sleeping in bed with her boyfriend, and police come in. They have a no-knock warrant, which essentially allows you to show up and just barge in without knocking, without giving warning that you were the police and you were there. And they repeatedly shot into the apartment. Breonna got shot 8 times. There were bullet holes all over the apartment. Another bullet, a stray bullet, went into the next apartment, which had a young infant living in there. Breonna's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, I mean, if you're in bed, if the police don't introduce themselves, you think you're getting robbed or worse. So Kenneth shot up a shot because he thought they were being intruded on. He called 911, but it was too late. The police had come in, shot Breonna dead. They said they were there alleging that they had reason to believe local drug dealers were possibly holding some of their drugs at Breonna's home. But the bottom line is the police recklessly, in my opinion, came in and just started shooting like the Wild Wild West in the middle of the night, and they killed Breonna. One police officer has been fired. 2 others are, I think, on some type of desk duty or leave, but nobody's been charged with anything, and there's been a lot of criticisms of the mayor here, of obviously the police department and the culture. So let's start there. I mean, you've been active pretty much from the beginning of this. Tell the audience kind of what is the background of the Louisville Metro PD before this incident. Take us through the decades, because there's similarities to other police departments, but we're steeped in the old Confederacy here and all of that.
So I'll take us back centuries first, because to understand the Louisville Metro Police Department, we have to understand the Louisville Police Department, which is what it was before our city merger. And it was founded in the 1820s, and that's in the thick of slavery. And it was founded to maintain, patrol, and regulate the slave population, capture them, lynch them, burn bodies, literally. It was created to protect private property, private capital. And unfortunately, in the case of the institution of slavery, a slave was private property. We were property. We were not even people. So that's why our police department was created. And this occurred, of course, it occurred through the Civil War. And we actually started to see black police officers, but not until the 1920s. And the first black man who was a police officer, his name was William Woods. He was killed in the line of duty for mistaken identity by a white drug addict. And his crime, that murder, was never brought to justice. And then you fast forward 100 years after that, 2020s, Breonna Taylor, David Yahya McAtee, who was killed by the National Guard, who came here to Louisville, just like they did over 50 years ago when we were marching in the streets for police terrorism. I said all that to say this. We were getting killed in the 1820s during the slavery pandemic. We were getting killed in the 1920s during the Jim Crow legal segregation pandemic. And we're getting killed in the 2020s during the coronavirus pandemic. The police department was created for this sole purpose, and they're still doing exactly what they were hired to do. And when you zoom in a little closer, Breonna Taylor, She is a one example of someone who has been killed. We have Dewantes Mitchell here in Louisville. We have a brother named Shelby Gazaway, Michael Newby. All of these black people have been assassinated by police in this city, and none of them have been brought to justice. None. And we're still waiting over 113 days later after Breonna was killed in her home for that justice. And that justice, as we demand it, it's also important we define it. And it looks like a whole lot of different changes. But from a transactional level, we have gotten the 911 call released with Kenneth Walker, which I strongly advise everyone to listen to, just to have your heart in this situation and know why we are suffering and struggling through this whole predicament. Listen to that 911 call.
911 call with Breonna Taylor's boyfriend.
Exactly. It hurts. It breaks my heart to listen to. And to a certain extent, I think Breonna's case did not pick up as much attention as the George Floyd killing or even the Ahmaud Arbery killing because it wasn't caught on camera. And seeing is believing, and we live in the viral age where everything has to be seen and everything has to get views. Well, you couldn't see her get killed, so it's almost as if some people look at it as if it didn't happen. It definitely happened, and the audio from the 911 call kind of depicts that, and the pain in his voice is very evident. But we got the 911 call released. We got his charges dropped because, oddly enough, he was charged for murder or attempted murder of the officers. And we got something passed called Breonna's Law that bans no-knock warrants from happening in the city of Louisville by any police officer. So we're seeing these victories, but the ultimate victory would be for these officers to be fired, would be for them to be taken to trial, and would be for them to be convicted. And beyond that is to fix what has been broken for centuries in our system, and it's based on our economic conditions.
You know, let me just give you, and by the way, press the like button, thumbs up button, right under the live stream. The thumbs up does not have a glove like I do. We're trying to be safe here. But the more people that press that like button, we'll get this to a bigger audience. Share this live stream, all that good stuff. And feel free, drop in a couple bucks in the super chat. Ain't cheap to travel. You know, I want to take you, like, we were talking in the car on the way here, and I'm thinking just like, I guess my white privilege, because we all have it as a white person. I'm like, wait a minute. She didn't have a criminal record. You know, he didn't have a criminal record. So if you wanted to interrogate her, why do you have to go in commando style in the middle of the night? Why can't you just, you know, during the day, you know, you call or you approach at work calmly and say, we have a few questions for you. And my cameraman's like, because they don't give a shit about black people. So that was kind of like my logical, the white part of me, thinking, it's beyond the pale to me that they went in there. She's an EMT. She's a medical worker. You know, she's helping the community. She's got no criminal record, nothing. You don't know. You might have theories because you, whatever, saw a suspected drug seller in her house or whatever. But it's that force in the middle of the night that I don't think gets a lot of conversation. The same reason with George Floyd. Why do you have to show up with several police officers for one stop? You don't do that to white people. And I think it goes to what you're talking about, which this is rooted in, obviously, white supremacy, slavery, and the economic segregation and violence towards black people, too.
Oh, absolutely. And people oftentimes don't think about that economic piece as we shout defund police, reform police, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. Even firing these officers, okay. But that's transactional versus transformational. Because if we fired those officers today, if we locked them up today, that doesn't necessarily stop them from doing what they did to Breonna Taylor in the future to someone else. It also doesn't change the fact that we are only 13% of this country's population, but 37% of incarcerations, over half of suspensions and expulsions. We are 40% of the homeless population, 50% of homeless families, and have less than 5% of the country's wealth. That's why when you hear me talk, anytime I'm out and about and I'm talking about black issues, I say the word reparations over and over and over and over. Because it's about repair, because we have been broken through the systems, and because we are broken, we are out here broke. I mean, like financially, we have nothing. We have no ownership. We don't have no power politically, socially, and economically in this country. If you got what you need economically. You don't have to sell drugs. You don't have to sell CDs like Alton Sterling. You don't have to have a counterfeit money like George Floyd. Everything that we're seeing play out in front of us is because we are in positions at the bottom of a country that we built. And until we address that, until we repair not only slavery, but also Jim Crow and all of the atrocities that happened post-slavery, which in a lot of cases were worse because slavery just locked us down, but the policies locked us out, we will never see a stop to police terrorism. We will never be in a country where people can say Black Lives Matter and actually mean it. Because in some cases, if you can't afford to live, you don't even have a life. So how can we shout Black Lives Matter when you don't have a life to live in the first place?
I'd like to ask you, like, you know, growing up here in Louisville, it's the same thing around the country. I've always said there's like, the government has fetishized the police, you know, propped them up to this pedestal, you know, Blue Lives Matter, they could do no wrong, you know, they have to make tough split decisions, just like the government has, you know, propped up and fetishized corporate America, and we have to bail them out, we have, you know. But the truth is, we're starting to see through this movement, I mean, I saw the Washington Post just did a story like, oh, maybe we should change the way we report instead of just reporting according to police sources, because a lot of the media just has basically reported what police sources leaked to them and just rolled it over. Can you kind of talk about like Louisville, maybe not Louisville, but Kentucky overall? I mean, there's been this, I guess, idolization of police and demonization of protesters for a long time, of Black people for a long time, of, oh, they're, you know, it's wearing a hoodie, they're up to no good. How do you see that starting to change a little bit through this movement, that people are starting to see, like, no, in a lot of cases, the police are, you know, kind of just white supremacists with guns. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
I share a birthday with Malcolm X. That's my spiritual brother. And my favorite Malcolm X quote is about progress. And he told a reporter once, we do not see progress. We haven't seen progress. If you stick a knife 9 inches in my back, pull it out 6, that's not progress. Even if you pull the knife all the way out, that's not progress. It's only once you begin to heal the wound that the knife made do we begin to see progress. In this country, in this state, in this city, we haven't healed the wound. We haven't pulled the knife out. In many cases, we don't even acknowledge that the knife is there. So before we see any sort of progress, it's going to take some severe acknowledgement of what's happening. And as you said earlier, we see that awokenness happening throughout the country, but we're still struggling. We're still having those fights. I still got people in my Twitter mentions saying all lives matter. People trying to demonize Breonna and talk about her as if she was some sort of drug queenpin. So we still have a lot of work to do to move us forward. But until that acknowledgement happens, we will never get to that next part, that reparations, that repair part, that redress part, that redistribution part. And then we can have some sort of closure. And really, it's going to take generations. It's going to take centuries. I hurt my thumb last year, and it took a split second. No time at all. But it took almost 6 months for my thumb to heal. So imagine how long it's going to take 400 years of oppression before we start to heal. So I use the word progress very lightly. I don't like to use it a lot because my lifetime is small on the entire radar of our existence in this country. And even if you look at our existence in this country in quadrants, you know, you have the 1600s, majority slavery, 1619 throughout, 1700s, all slavery, 1800s, pretty much majority slavery again. And then you have the 1900s. 3/4 of our existence in this country has been in bondage. So no, we don't see progress yet. We still have people who are arguing about monuments being torn down that honor the most inhumane, evil people in history. The Confederate flag might as well be a swastika, and we're just now taking it down in Mississippi. We're just now taking down statues of Jefferson Davis here in Kentucky. We're just now acknowledging the fact that we should not be honoring Confederates. And it's not even up for debate what the Confederacy stood for. Because if they say, oh, we were fighting for states' rights, yeah, states' rights for slavery. We were fighting for taxes, yeah, taxes so you don't get taxed on slaves. or people who say that the flag itself wasn't about racism. The person who designed that flag was very clear that it was a symbol of white supremacy. So we still have a lot of education that needs to take place before we have some sort of progress, but we're definitely seeing some transactional progress through these laws being passed, through the firing of officers. But it's going to take an entire systematic reset that includes reparations, because we can't talk about black liberation without reparations, and that's a must. That is essential to fix our position in this country.
I want to ask you, because in the case of Breonna's murder, also David McAtee, there's a pattern here. If you don't have body cameras, it seems like the police lie with impunity. The report, like amazingly, the police report in the murder of Breonna Taylor came out recently. They said there was no injury. They said there was no forced entry. I mean, she died. They said there was no forced entry. You got witnesses. They were, using a battering ram to get in there. In the case of George Floyd, originally, the police lied about what happened. They said, made it sound like a routine kind of arrest. He was in medical distress. They kind of left out like the knee in his neck for almost 9 minutes. David McAtee, by all accounts, was beloved in the community here, owned a barbecue shop, and you have police say he fired at them first, but the New York Times did a piece they somehow figured out through visuals and surveillance, whatever, that the police fired first. So in all these cases, I mean, you have police not only instigating and basically being, I call it police terrorism, but they lie. And for most of American history, it's been swept under the rug when they lie. Can you kind of talk about, do you see, I mean, that changing? Because in the case of Breonna, we didn't have the video. They lied at first. I don't know what is taking so long for this investigation. At the very least, there's reckless and endangerment here. But the police getting away with this kind of stuff, do you see that changing at all through this movement?
My least favorite phrase as of late is people of color, because it erases the systemic oppression that has been placed on black Americans who descend from slavery. And if you think about it, in the fruition of this country, we used to be the colored people, but we went from colored, we were called Negro throughout, to black American, African American, to a bunch of other unruly words. And now everyone is a colored person, essentially. But I'm going to use it for a little metaphor, and I'm an artist, so bear with me. How you spell police?
Police.
And when you take out people of color, POC, what's left?
POCOR.
When you take out people of color, you got LIE left.
True.
The truth is right there in the name of the institution. They lie. And you could say they lied to protect that private capital or that private property. You could say they lied to protect that supremacy. They lie to keep a certain group regulated and maintained and patrolled, which are the descendants of those slaves they were created to patrol. Or you can say they lied just because they enjoy it. I'm not entirely sure. I don't have the data to back it, and I don't like speaking without that data, but police lie. You can't spell police without the word lie. They lie.
Can we talk about, we'll get back to Breonna, but something you said was really interesting. I don't know, 2 weeks ago, there was some hope in Louisville. I mean, Charles Booker, this momentum looked like he might pull off an upset against Amy McGrath, who's, your classic establishment, cardboard cutout politician, doesn't really stand for much that I could see. She's not so objectionable like a Trump, but she's certainly not going to change the conditions for this part of the community. But Charles Booker had a lot of momentum. Polls showed he was closing in. And then all of a sudden you see for 600,000 people, they got one polling place. There was, definitely an expansion of mail-in ballots due to the pandemic. But on that election day, you were telling me that a lot of people in this community, this is the West Side like you were talking about, high poverty, they didn't even know the details. They didn't know that they could mail in ballots. They didn't know that there was one precinct. Can you kind of talk about the further disadvantages black voters and black people have compared to maybe people up north that they have all the information?
I call this information segregation. So as we've canvassed this area, a number of elders, black elders specifically, were unaware of the single polling place. They were unaware of the process to get an absentee ballot. Most of that information lived online. But because over half of the people in my community don't have internet access, it's almost as if that information online doesn't exist. And it's hard to care if you're unaware. So when voting day happens, in Kentucky, by the way, the polls close earlier than most of the states. I think it's us, maybe Mississippi, and maybe 2 other states.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I found that image heartbreaking.
Right.
I don't know if you saw, but at the polling place here, you just have black voters just banging on the window to try to get in because the cutoff was like 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. And if you work, you're an essential worker, like so many black folk who had to work through this pandemic. You got that 9 to 5, you got kids you got to pick up and take care of. How are you supposed to get to a polling place by 6 o'clock? If that's your only option because you didn't have access to that mail-in ballot. Or when you call the county clerk, they're not answering the phone, or their voice messages, it's full. Their answer machine is full. There was just such a huge disconnect with how the process was supposed to work. And I believe this was the first time Kentucky ever opened it up for anyone and let you kind of do no excuse absentee voting. And it was a nightmare. And I think I just saw an article recently where people were saying we should learn from Kentucky and that we got a C for our efforts, like the grade C, which I thought that was kind of generous because we still had so many people who were just suppressed from voting. And the people who were suppressed are the people who have been oppressed. So we saw that play out, and that was a huge role in Charles Booker not winning the race, I truly believe.
Mm-hmm. And you were kind of talking about before, their rationale for the search warrant on Breonna Taylor was, they thought that she might be facilitating a drug dealer, or he might have kept some of his product at her apartment. But damn, do they spend a lot of money investigating drug dealing? Not a lot of money. How do we get these people jobs? How do we get investment into the community? How do we get mental health services into the community? If they spent the amount of money that they do on the police, on the equipment, on the terrorism, on just basic jobs programs, I don't say training because I think that's a bullshit neoliberal thing, but just trying to help this community, same thing for Detroit, Flint, Milwaukee, Cleveland, a lot of places we go. You would see crime dip way down. That part of the discussion I haven't heard as much at these protests. I haven't heard also about, we could do protests, around the block for months and months and months, but what about organized boycotts? What about divestment? Has that been something organizers and activists here have spoken about?
Yeah, we've been talking about divestment. We kind of lobbied the person, Councilman Bill Hollander, who's in charge of our budget as far as the committee goes at the Metro Council level. And it didn't work. It did not work. I don't think people were ready to wrap their minds around what it meant to defund police or divest from police, which is what I always advocate for, and taking those funds and allocating them elsewhere. But going back to transactional versus transformational, LMPD perpetuates drug dealers and drug users. And before I say how, I just want to zoom back out and go back some decades. We fought, 60s, the civil rights era, somewhat progression. 70s, deindustrialization, where so many factories were shut down in the inner city, so many certification programs taken out of our high schools. 80s, we get hit with the crack epidemic that devastated black communities, just completely destroyed families left and right, and they were already jobless. So now you got this drug that you can sell to put food on the table, or you can smoke it because you have no hope in life. And then you go to the 90s, where we have our Bill Clinton, who so many people when I was growing up said he was basically our first black president, I guess because he played the saxophone. But he devastated black families with the crime bill. And then we get to the 2000s. Biden, by the way. Yes, which we could talk about forever. But I said all that to say this, just decades of essentially defunding our communities, defunding our lives, and so much investment in police. In Louisville alone, about $256 million goes between our officers and corrections. We've got $250 million being put into caging people. Less than a quarter of that is put into caring for people. But I say they perpetuate the issue because why are we spending $250 million kicking in the door of a petty drug dealer or petty offender, petty crimes? Why don't we put those resources, if you really want to stop it, put those resources into the jobs like you were saying, but also we don't control the trains and the planes and the automobiles that ship these drugs to our country. So if you really want to stop what you claim you want to stop and why you're dumping millions upon millions and billions as a country into police, you need to go to the borders. You need to holler at your friends, U.S. government, in Mexico who are helping get these drugs here, or in Colombia where that crack is being made. That's your issue. You open up the borders to make that happen. But they're worried about a Breonna Taylor who was allegedly involved in selling drugs, instead of worrying about the root of the issue, which is not only the fact that we have a lack of opportunity and resources, but also the fact that you have perpetuated, Ronald Reagan as a president in the 80s has perpetuated the crack epidemic.
And I find it, I cover national politics, and one part of the media says the Republicans are terrible, the other part says the Democrats are terrible. But in reality, there's not so much distance from the two parties. I mean, Democrats better on some social issues, this and that, but economically, a lot of these areas that are depressed have had Democratic rule for decades and decades and decades, and those Democrats, the color that they focus on most is green, getting those dollars from the donors, the Chamber of Commerce, real estate developers, this and that, and as a result, they'll throw little murals, Black Lives Matter Plaza, Black Lives Matter on the ground. In New York City, Bill de Blasio, a Democrat, just defunded the police by $1 billion, which was just kind of an accounting trick. They're not actually cutting the police budget. So the problem is, you have this Republican Party, which has been steeped in racism and white supremacy, Nixon, the Southern strategy, but you have the Democratic Party that's kind of been enabling. I say Nancy Pelosi drove the getaway car when Trump and McConnell just robbed the Treasury. So if you have this two-party system that one is just hostile to black people, the other one gives lip service to black people, what do you do outside of electoral politics? And that's asking someone that just got elected.
And I ran as a Democrat. I don't have any marriage to any party. And if our local Democratic Party saw this, they would probably be at my neck, and I don't care because I don't have permanent friends or permanent enemies. I have permanent interest. And I got on Metro Council not to make friends anyway, but to make progress. So I've always heard that the Republicans were wolves and that the Democrats were wolves, but they just had on sheep's clothing. Or that the Republican will call you the N-word today and the Democrat will call you N-word next week. That they're one and the same. They just have different tactics. But it's going to take a whole lot of political education to move away from that two-party system. Because even in this district, District 4 in Louisville, Kentucky, which is the most populated, most diverse, most vibrant district, the most powerful district, because we have the entire downtown business district in this district. There were over 13,000 registered Democrats, roughly about 3,000 Republicans, and less than 1,000 independents. I couldn't have won this race if I didn't participate in that two-party system, and more specifically, if I didn't participate as a Democrat. And it's going to take generations of education to get people out of that mindset, because as you said, they're really one and the same, just different tactics.
Can you kind of talk about what you've been seeing out there in the protest movement? We've obviously seen the protest itself, but in a lot of these other communities, there's kind of mini organizing within that. Obviously, there was organizing to get that no-knock warrant banned. Obviously, there's been organizing going on to get defunding of the police, but have these protests created other organizing and other kind of action among this community where in the past a lot of these communities kind of just fell into like hopelessness and despair?
In the past, we saw the black church existing in a silo to a certain extent, black nonprofits, grassroots organizations such as BLM or the Kentucky Alliance. We saw all sorts of black institutions working on their own platforms. The protests that have taken place recently in Louisville, Kentucky, have created a sense of urgency for us to work together in ways that we never have before. And also, because it's 2020 and we have such a wide range of access to information and videos and news, that urgency was even more dire because as white people and wealthy people with money saw what was happening in the world literally burning down, they were handing out money left and right. So as we put our minds together, we think about how can we benefit from this situation? How can we get out of this situation? How can we have justice, whatever the perception of justice is? So it's kind of forced us into these spaces, figuratively and literally, but it's also shown some of our weaknesses. The fact that we don't have a national black agenda, the fact that we don't have a local black agenda.
Hell, the Congressional Black Caucus keeps endorsing white corporatists over progressive black candidates. They just endorsed Jamal Bowman's opponent. They didn't endorse Charles Booker. So even in Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus is not really supporting progressive grassroots black candidates.
And people come at me for saying this, but they're also not advocating for what they were created for, which is the ex-Negro, the black American who descends from slavery. And I acknowledge all other struggles, whether that's the LGBTQ community, whether that's the immigrant community, whether that's any community that has faced some sort of oppression, our indigenous people, everyone. But what we have to realize when it comes to the Black Caucus, the NAACP, the Urban League, the Black Church, all of these black institutions that exist, they exist to fight our issues. And too many times we get off of our square. We're worried about everything else. The Black Caucus, they're worried about DACA. Yes, fight DACA, but it should not be at the very top of your issue when we are living in third world conditions in a first world country, the most richest and powerful, and we are the most poor and powerless. How are you fighting for DACA when we essentially are about to be erased from the United States of America? And when I say that, I mean the McKinsey reported that by 2053, which is probably advanced because of COVID, black wealth is supposed to shrink to zero. There's a brother named Dr. Sandy Darity, and he is the leading economist, and I would say the best brain to even break down reparations in a way that makes sense since the Reconstruction period when slavery ended. And he talks about reparations in a way that I strongly encourage everyone to check out. He has a book called From Here to Equality, and he talks about reparations and unpacks it and breaks down myths of how over the last few decades we want to bank black or have black businesses or education will liberate us. None of that works. We have been waiting on it to work for centuries and it hasn't worked. We've been waiting on Africa to save us. They're not coming to save us. They're not paying us reparations. In fact, they apologize for being complacent in the slave trade. We have a unique justice claim in this country that we have to fight for, and we can never let the U.S. government off of the hook for that. And I'm realizing in this moment that that conversation is happening, but we have to be careful not to get distracted, whether it's because of the monuments being torn down or a mural being painted or that perceived illusion of inclusion when it comes to the workplace or some of the policies that are being changed with businesses and corporations. That's all cute, but until we get fixed economically, this is going to happen over and over and over.
What happens, if the election were held today? Looks like Joe Biden would be the winner, according to the polls. It ain't breaking news that Trump is violent, Trump is racist, all these things. I also don't think it's breaking news that Joe Biden is just a different kind of racist, a less in-your-face racist, a less Twitter era racist, but the policies are certainly racist. The ignorance is certainly racist. But what happens, if Biden wins? A lot of these white allies now that are out in the streets with black people, are they going to be challenging Joe Biden and the Democratic Party the next time a black person is killed sleeping in bed, and there's another Department of Justice investigation, but nothing happens? I mean, remember, it was President Obama's DOJ that began the investigation into Eric Garner's killing. Nothing. That officer wasn't prosecuted. I remember I was at Standing Rock. I mean, that was a Native issue, but grenades fired at Native Americans, tear gas, freezing rain, and nothing happened. Obama said, well, we'll let it play out. Ferguson, this and that. I guess my question is, are people going back to sleep once it's a Democratic president, once it's, if it's a Democratic Congress, because, the federal level could do a lot to really implement reforms, not only of the police, but actually have some programs for black people, not just coming around to churches around election time.
That's why lineage matters. On my refrigerator for my almost 3-year-old, there are these magnet puppets. We got Frederick Douglass, we got Langston Hughes, Rosa Parks is up there, Maya Angelou. But on our dishwasher, there's a finger puppet by himself, and that's President Barack Obama. And I originally got it because I wanted him to look at it and see himself and think, I can be the president of the United States one day. But the more that I learn and the more that I grow and expand my mind politically, I realize he can't, because Barack Obama does not have lineage of being a descendant of slavery. He actually descends from Confederates who sold slaves and who owned slaves. He has a father from Kenya and he has a mother from Kansas. He doesn't know, it's not in his veins, it's not in his blood to fight this fight. And we expected him to, because he was clapping at the churches, because he used some of our slang, because he listened to Jay-Z and Kendrick Lamar. We got tricked and we fell asleep. And he didn't pass any laws or do anything of substance for black people. But going back to what I said about the CBC, he did a whole lot for everybody else, including police. Mm-hmm. You got to look Barack Obama up. Blue Lives Matter. I don't know what the bill was called, but look up Barack Obama, Blue Lives Matter, and read for yourself. And what we saw during his presidency was a peak. The viralness of a Mike Brown, of a Trayvon Martin. He didn't do anything about it. Even going back to economic conditions, Barack Obama said he didn't believe in reparations, which Mitch McConnell used that as an excuse when he was asked about reparations and said, I share the same sentiment as President Barack Obama. SBA loans. Under President Bush, who I don't rock with, so don't get it twisted, we got 9% of the federal loans, which we should get 13% if we're 13% of the population or more. But under Barack Obama, we got like 2%. HBCU funding was down. And the cherry on top of all of that disaster of a Barack Obama's presidency was the fact that he made Joe Biden his VP, the man who penned that crime bill that put more black men in jail today in this country than there are women in jail in the entire world. That was his vice president. And now we're about to have him as a president, potentially. But we still got folks with Barack Obama's picture in their homes, him and Michelle and their family. I don't miss Barack, and I didn't vote for Barack. And we have to be careful with symbols over substance, because he was a symbolic president. And as we saw, that symbolism wasn't enough to keep Breonna from getting killed, to keep David from getting killed, to keep Ahmaud Arbery from getting killed, to keep George Floyd from getting killed. We got tricked. We got bamboozled. We got flim-flam with a Barack Obama. And I can't wait for the day, even though Tupac said, even though it seems heaven sent, we ain't ready to have a black president, for us to have our real first black president, who by black I mean descends from slavery, descends from Jim and Jane Crow, descends from mass incarceration, the crack epidemic, police terrorism, who descends from the blood, sweat, and tears that built this country, because he is not that. He is not African American, which is a phrase that makes no sense, and it was created because we don't know where in Africa we came from, but we are American. Unfortunately, we are Americans who descend from slavery. But once we get fixed, because we were broken, we can cut the rest of that off and just be American like everybody else who has been accepted into this country. And in some cases, those people who have been accepted, like Barack, look like us, but they don't live like us.
Where do things stand now in Louisville? You know, there was a protest yesterday. There's been protests, I mean, it seems like almost every day. There's the square where there was a lot of people gathering since, you know, not just the George Floyd protests, but after Breonna's killing. I think the corporations, the government, the kind of what I call the United Corporations of America, are simply just waiting this thing out. You know, let them protest, let them go for months and months and months. They'll get exhausted. Yeah, we'll throw a couple crumbs here and there. You know, some murals, maybe a couple reforms, but we're not going to change the system here. You know, I see Chase Bank putting Black Lives Matter on their window, even though they, you know, their predatory loans into black communities, higher interest rates. I guess my question is, do these protests continue indefinitely until real change comes, or how does this evolve? Because the protests seem to be continuing, not just here and elsewhere. And my other question is, what does justice look like for Breonna Taylor? Because it seems like this investigation, I don't know what they're investigating at this point. This happened in March. We know what happened. The witnesses have spoken. They have all the evidence they need, but they certainly are dragging this thing out.
Earlier when I said that Republicans are wolves and Democrats are wolves, but with sheep's clothing, I would almost consider myself a wolf of an organizer. And I'm a political wolf in sheep's clothing, and I'm an elected official who just left an organizer meeting where I have to say in response to what you said is that I plead the fifth. Because in some cases we have to keep our railroad underground, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But the city of Louisville has passed 100 days where we have not seen what the big demand is as far as justice goes, with those officers being tried and arrested. But we just had such a productive conversation as organizers, and we are going to change our tactics, and we are going to see a change happen. I just can't voice what that change is right now.
Fair enough. I know I'm asking somebody that's not a woman, but I'd like your thoughts. There has been some thought that Breonna Taylor has gotten less attention, her case, because she is a woman, as a black woman killed. Obviously, we've seen Native American women kidnapped, raped. It doesn't really make the national airwaves. Do you think any part of Breonna Taylor nationally, with, you know, maybe less coverage compared to George Floyd? I know you said the video is a big part of it, but what do you think gender, does gender play? Have a role here?
It could, and I don't really like throwing my opinion out too much. I'm not sure of the data that supports women and them being victims of police terrorism is swept under the rug more than the men. We've seen the men at much higher rates. Right. Men are incarcerated at much higher rates. So what I will say is, for sure, we haven't seen the Breonna Taylor killing. It's almost like it's this fantastical, I don't want to say myth because she's gone. She's never coming back. But it's almost as if it's fetishized and fantasized now. And we look at the internet and we see memes left and right. She has been turned into a meme in some cases. And it breaks my heart because the more we see those memes, the less serious I think people are taking it. But as you said, as someone who's not a woman, I can't necessarily speak from that perspective. But a voice that I hope people can check out is a local poet here, a local activist, a local thought leader named Hannah Drake. And she's actually releasing a piece here soon in the next week that's going to dive deep into her perspective of why Breonna Taylor has not been brought to justice. So Hannah Drake, please check her out. She is someone who I truly respect and love and appreciate. So peep that.
We actually reached out to her, yeah. Last question. I definitely don't want to miss the fact that all this is happening during a pandemic. We know that COVID, just the unemployment numbers that just came out, among white people, 10%, black people, over 15%. To me, those numbers are bullshit. the real unemployment is much, much higher, particularly for black people. Black people have had worse health outcomes with coronavirus. Louisville is the biggest city, I think, or I think one of the biggest cities in Kentucky. And Kentucky hasn't been it's not a hot zone now, but can you kind of talk about all of these things happening at once? The Black Lives Matter movement, Breonna Taylor's murder, David McAtee, while dealing with a pandemic. I mean, you already were in a pandemic. It's called systemic poverty and racism, and now you got this health pandemic. Have people in this community gotten the resources they need? Have they gotten the unemployment they need? Have they gotten, the information they need compared to white cities, maybe, in Lexington and beyond?
Governor Andy Beshear, I'm so thankful, has been proactive. And if you look at maps, if you look at the studies done as far as how Kentucky has responded to COVID-19, you will see that we're on the forefront of not necessarily having as many peaks, as many deaths, and I'm very appreciative of that, and that's true to his leadership. And Mayor Fisher and all the other mayors around the state have followed suit. We've definitely seen that systemic racism play out in COVID-19, in unemployment. And to a certain extent, we have been proactive about that as well. But because Louisville is one of the most segregated, most racist cities in this country, it's definitely going to take some systematic reset for us to address it in the way that it needs to be addressed. It took us weeks upon weeks into the pandemic before the west end of Louisville, the black end, the poor end of Louisville, got to see a testing site. And that testing site was actually organized by people in this community. And finally, after we organized our own testing site, we saw the government organize one. And of course, they called it the first, and they took all the credit for it. But we need government help. We need government to do everything that they possibly can to take care of us. But going back to that piece of political education, there's still so much ignorance that is embedded in this state. Andy Beshear offered and made some suggestions of giving all black Kentuckians free health care. And it was like white people got told they lost everything. They couldn't have a house anymore, and they had to live in the forest because they were enraged. They hated that. I wish they were as enraged that we were majority of the cases and the deaths, but they weren't.
So powerful. Thank you, new elected city council member, Ja'Cory Arthur. Hey, he was an activist, musician and an activist for many years here, and now he's an elected official. So I don't know if you're a Bernie guy, but I truly believe, a lot of people, whatever, not happy with him now, but he did say from the ground up, and local city council, local level, it's not just the federal level, because a lot of these changes are going to have to happen on the local level. And I'm sure, quite a few of those city council members are not going to like the reforms you want to bring, but we need fighters like you. So by the way, I saw all the super chats. I just didn't want to interrupt the flow. So thank you for all the super chats. You could actually go to statuscoup.com/road trip. You'll see all the photos we've been taking from this reporting trip. You could also donate there if you didn't in the super chat. Hey, your support is what's helping us go across the country. It ain't cheap for 3 people. So we really appreciate it. We'll be in Louisville the next few days. We're reaching out to people now to try to get more interviews. Who knows? Things change on a dime, so protests might be happening, but we're going to kind of play it by ear what's going on. If you are not on our text list, get on our text list so you can get a text when we're live next. Text COUP to 370-370. That's COUP to 370-370. Am I missing anything?
People want to know how to find Ja'Cory.
Oh, yeah. Oh, by the way, you were getting a lot of love in the super chat. How can people find you?
Ja'Cory Arthur on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Spell Ja'Cory, because I spelled it wrong.
JECOREYARTHUR. JECOREYARTHUR.
And can I just make like just a real quick, subtle promotion for Status Quo? As important as these stories are that we're going around the country telling, it's equally as important to introduce you to the people that will never be on CNN. No offense. it's very rare that a man like this is going to be on CNN or quoted in the New York Times. And if they do, they'll selectively quote them and this and that. It's really important to show you the activists on the ground, the community leaders, the movement leaders, the newly elected leaders that you're not going to see in corporate media. That's why we're doing this, because there's a reason you don't see them on air, because they don't want to focus on these issues. It ain't good for the status quo. It ain't good for the bottom line. Certainly not good for the multi-billion-dollar corporate conglomerates that own the media. Not just the national media, but the local media too, because we could get into a whole nother live stream about the local media. So definitely check him out. I'm glad we made contact. And by the way, that's part of why we go out into the field, not just to interview people, but you make contacts, you build relationships, and that way, we could keep in touch with people and know what's going on the ground, even when we're not here. So thank you for watching. We will be live again later, I think around 7 o'clock, I'm not sure. And we'll be here tomorrow as well. So statusquo.com/roadtrip for the photos, for ways to support us. We really appreciate it. Peace.
That was so true. I've been on